The year was 2004, and the city of St. Jude, Illinois, was not on any map of tourist destinations. It was a rust-belt graveyard of forgotten factories and broken dreams, a place where the American dream had gone to die, only to be replaced by something far more predatory. At the center of this rot sat the Iron Syndicate, a criminal enterprise that didn't just control the streets, they owned the very infrastructure of the city. Part 1. The Empire of Shadows. The Iron Syndicate was not a collection of street-level thugs in hoodies, they were a paramilitary corporate entity. Their leader, a man known only as the Architect, had spent the 1990s consolidating the city's disparate criminal factions. By 2004, they operated out of a repurposed, windowless meatpacking plant on the edge of the river. Their business model was diversified. They ran the illegal gambling dens in the back of convenience stores, the high-end prostitution rings catering to visiting state politicians, and, most lucratively, the illicit distribution of pharmaceuticals that bled into the suburbs like an oil slick. They had employees in every stratum of society. Corrupt patrol officers who looked the other way when syndicate trucks rolled into town, city council members who ensured that zoning laws favored their investments, and accountants like me. My role was to sanitize the blood money, turning the proceeds of fear into legitimate portfolios of real estate and local retail. I remember the smell of that office, stale coffee, ozone from the servers, and the underlying, metallic scent of anxiety. Every digit I entered into the ledger was a brick in the wall built to hide the reality of St. Jude from the outside world. I was the architect of their silence, the man who ensured the money trailed off into untraceable offshore accounts, leaving no breadcrumbs for the IRS or the local precinct. Part 2. The gears of the machine. The syndicate ran St. Jude like a feudal state. If a local shopkeeper wanted protection from petty vandalism, they paid the stability tax to the syndicate. If a construction company wanted a contract, they had to hire syndicate-approved subcontractors who worked at a fraction of the cost because they used undocumented labor the gang had smuggled across the border. It was a closed loop. The money came from the people, was cleaned by the syndicate, and then reinvested into the city to make the gang look like the only force capable of development. The internal culture was one of brutal meritocracy. The enforcers were ex-military, men who moved with a terrifying, efficient silence. I once watched an enforcer dismantle a rival who had tried to muscle into our slot machine territory. It wasn't a brawl, it was an autopsy. They didn't just kill, they made sure the message was broadcasted through the silence of the aftermath. I lived in a constant state of dissociation. I would go home to my beautiful wife, Elena, and our 2 children, playing the role of the devoted suburban father, while my mind was calculating the exact percentage of grease needed to keep the mayor's mouth shut for another month. The hypocrisy of my existence was a weight that I carried daily, a heavy, suffocating mantle of guilt that I disguised with expensive suits and polite small talk. Part 3. The friction and the fire. In late 2005, the friction between the syndicate and a rising wave of federal interest began to spark. The ghost transactions, the money that vanished during the laundering process, weren't accidents, they were being skimmed by a faction within the syndicate that wanted to overthrow the architect. As the accountant, I was caught in the crossfire. I was the keeper of the ledger, and both sides needed me to confirm the location of the lost funds. The tension in St. Jude became palpable. The streets, usually quiet under the syndicate's iron thumb, began to erupt with drive-by shootings and targeted disappearances. I remember a humid August night when the syndicate's headquarters was firebombed. The sky turned an unnatural orange, and for a few hours the city realized that their protectors were mortal. The vulnerability was contagious. The public, long cowed into submission, began to whisper. The police force, split between those on the payroll and those terrified of the coming collapse, became paralyzed. Every day I walked into that meatpacking plant, I felt like I was walking into a tomb. I was dealing with millions in assets, but my life felt like a depreciating commodity, one that could be liquidated at any moment by a bullet or a ledger entry. Part 4. The great unraveling. The end came not with a dramatic raid, but with a betrayal so elegant it was almost beautiful. Sarah, my corporate counterpart, had been the one skimming the funds. She hadn't been planning a coup, she had been planning an exit strategy. She had been feeding evidence to the FBI for 18 months, turning me into her unwitting scapegoat. She had expertly placed digital fingerprints on my computer, creating a trail that led directly to my desk. The day the feds arrived, it felt like the world had slowed down. I was sitting at my desk when the front doors of the office were blown off their hinges. Chaos ensued, not the tactical, controlled violence of the syndicate, but the panicked, messy desperation of the law. I watched from behind my reinforced glass wall as the empire I had helped build disintegrated in real time. The architect was arrested in his office, his face a mask of cold indifference, but I knew that even in handcuffs, he was already calculating his leverage. I stood frozen, my hands hovering over the keyboard, realizing that the house of cards I had spent years maintaining had finally collapsed under its own weight. The sound of shouting, the smell of gunpowder, and the sight of men in tactical gear swarming the halls. It was the sound and smell of my own life ending. Part 5. The long shadow. The fallout took years to settle. The syndicate was dismantled, but the void they left behind was filled by smaller, hungrier, and far more violent gangs that fought over the scraps of St. Jude for the rest of the decade. My life, however, was shattered. I spent 2 years in a federal facility, a stark, gray existence that stood in sharp contrast to the luxury I had once helped maintain. I was eventually released, but the man who walked out of those gates was a ghost. Elena had taken the children and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a forwarding address that led to a dead end. I moved to the Pacific Northwest, living under a new name, working in a warehouse, and spending my nights staring at the rain against the window. I am a builder who has learned the cost of bad mortar. I spent the last few years trying to put the pieces of a normal life together, but there is always a lingering fear, a phantom noise in the night, the flash of a black sedan, reminding me that for men like us, there is no true retirement. We are always just one ledger entry away from the past coming back to claim what is left of us. The past isn't a memory, it's a living, breathing entity that waits for you in the quiet, reminding you of the damage you caused and the people you left behind in the ruins of your own ambition. I still dream of the meatpacking plant, of the flickering monitors, and of the look on Sarah's face the day she walked out of my office for the last time. My redemption is not a story I can write, but a life I have to live, one day at a time, hoping the silence never breaks.